Okay then. Today, this week, we're going to work on this article by Hilary Putnam called Brains in a Vat. You already know about this idea of brains in a vat. It's a modern version of the evil demon problem of Descartes. It's of the essence, of course, in this assignment that we actually read the article Brains in a Vat by Hilary Putnam that he published in 1982, I believe. And it's a fascinating article. It really blew my mind for a long time. I'm going to try today to show you sort of what's going on. I mean, I think sometimes when we approach philosophers, and particularly when we approach these kinds of 20th century philosophy articles that can be very dense, and we don't always know what it is that the person is up to. That is, those of us, if you're not a real aficionado of the particular conversation, you might not understand why they're doing what they're doing. So that's my goal today, to try to put Hilary Putnam's Brains in a Vat article in some kind of philosophical context for you to sort of see what's going on. And I hope if I could do that, then you can have a better experience with this really wonderful article. I really strongly recommend that you really do read it. So we will be situating it here in our epistemology class in the way we've been doing lately, talking about skepticism, that is. We've been talking about the empiricist tradition. We went from Hume, then to Wittgenstein, now from Wittgenstein coming to Putnam. Putnam is influenced by Wittgenstein. I will note that when it comes up. And so let's just take a look at this very fascinating article, Hilary Putnam's Brain in a Vat. As I say, it is an empiricist response to skepticism. And that will also bring us to grips, I think, with some basic questions about the empiricist response to skepticism, whether or not we find it to be persuasive. Okay, so basics then. Putnam's agenda. You got then Descartes' evil demon problem. How does that run? Descartes says it could be that there was a force such as an evil demon that was systematically distorting all of your experiences, or even simply producing all of your experiences, such that you thought that you were having a life of a particular kind, in a particular body, in a particular place, with particular things going on. But everything about that is wrong. You're just being caused to think this by an evil demon. Descartes thinks that follows from his view of God, because the thing that I think we often miss about Descartes is very heavily invested in the idea that it is God who has put your rationality and your consciousness and in general your soul into your physical body. So Hilary Putnam, as I say, we've already seen a couple of responses to skepticism. I talked about Berkeley and Hume, and I talked about Wittgenstein. So we ought to be able then to see sort of more clearly the way things kind of go with Putnam here. But what he is doing is criticizing Cartesian skepticism with an empiricist argument. The rationalist idea, notice how the idea that you don't have direct perception of the world, but that rather what you experience is a mental representation of the world, is a kind of rationalist idea. Even with Kant, who I think in this particular, today when we're talking about Putnam, I think we have to be fair to Kant, and he does do some of the synthetic work that Putnam does as well. But anyway, what Hilary Putnam denied is this idea that perception is forming a representation. We get that from Descartes, but it's really baked in with Kant. That what happens is that you have some sort of causal contact with the external world, and then a representation of some kind is formed, and that's what you inspect. And of course, as we've been talking about all along, once you have a mental representational theory of mind, then you just are with the skeptical problem. It's just part of your conceptual structure, because you've got a question about what's the relationship between your picture of the world and the world itself. So again, Putnam following Wittgenstein in that third bullet point, rejecting this Cartesian theater, little theater in your mind where something's being projected, the movie's being projected, the movie that's directed by you, I guess, or the structure of your mind. And Putnam also thinks that's incorrect. So now, notice now you've got a really basic grounding in terms of what Putnam's doing. You know, he's an empiricist. You know what these empiricist arguments in the 20th century are like, and you know what his target is. His target is this claim that we might be brains in vats. Putnam is going to argue that we cannot be brains in vats. He thinks he can prove that we're not brains in vats. That's the sort of audacious kind of note of the article. So then that last one is important. Putnam and another philosopher also very much influenced by Wittgenstein, Saul Kripke. These people have a certain theory of meaning. We can call it a causal theory of reference. In the case of Kripke, he talks about when something gets its name, there's sort of a baptismal event when something gets its name, and then that's the thing that's going to be referred to by that name. What's the point of coming up with sort of stories like that? The point is that, again, there's nothing magical about it. There's some sort of causal story about events that happen in the environment, in the body maybe, or to the body, such that the person was caused to have the belief that they have. The beliefs don't come from God or outer space. They're not innate. And they don't have to be representational. They don't have to have content. Because notice this is an empiricist argument, and much of what is said here will be in line with some kind of operationalist or behaviorist model of defining the psychological terms. Okay, so reference and causal chains. Now, just to do some sort of real old-fashioned epistemology, you want to be some kind of foundationalist, not a relativist. And so a basic strategy there is to say, look, you're in the mental state that you're in because of some chain of events that cause you to be in the state. And there are bad chains of events, such as maybe somebody lied to you and caused you to be in this state. And there are good chains of events, such as maybe that you saw it with your own eyes and so forth. So in any event, this idea that you've got the right kind of causal grounding, you've got the right kind of story about how it is that you came to believe that is the same way, it's just a way of talking about justification, it says there. So, all right, but then Putnam takes this in this extraordinarily imaginative direction, and he says this. He says, say you're out at the beach and an ant is walking around in the sand, and the ant is just doing its thing, and it just happens to leave an ant trail that looks exactly like the World War II English Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. You say, hey, gee, Marge, look, this ant trail looks just exactly like Winston Churchill. But you wouldn't say it represents Winston Churchill. Even if it looks more like Winston Churchill than my sketch of Winston Churchill, since I'm a terrible sketcher. So it's better likeness of Winston Churchill, but it doesn't represent Winston Churchill. If someone was painting, if someone was had an airplane and they were skywriting and they tried to do a picture of Winston Churchill and there was a cloud right next to them that looked exactly like Winston Churchill, but still, again, they're not very good. Skywriting would represent Winston Churchill. In that case, right, what's our intuition? That there's this story has to do with some kind of intention, that somebody meant for something to represent something. Which of course explains why I can have, say, I can represent a red apple with a plastic blue triangle if I want. I can say, hey, from now on we'll use this plastic blue triangle to represent red delicious apples if we want. Why not? Because after all, third bullet point, if representation were if you had a similarity theory of representation, then representation would be a reciprocal relationship. That is, Winston Churchill would represent the picture of Winston Churchill just as much as the picture of Winston Churchill would represent him. And that we don't think makes sense, do we? I don't think we do. I don't represent pictures of me. So then another way, another angle, you've got this causal story. So what is it, sort of denying that it's not just this, see, the Cartesian has a dualistic picture that the soul is kind of disembodied and disconnected to the body. So the soul has its states, these mental states, which are completely different from the physical states. So then that suggests that the soul, since the soul, I mean, when we talk about in the head, or maybe just not in the material world at all, some kind of very traditionalist attitude towards the way we consider the mind. But these empiricists who are naturalists, they want to be some kind of naturalists, conceptually interesting question. They just aren't buying that. And so they want to say, no, look, you can think about it as the content. Remember, we're talking about the causal role of the content. So narrow content would be the idea that this mental content is all in the head. And wide content, the idea that what we're calling the content of the mental state or the attentional state is to some extent a function of contingent features of the external environment. That's the idea. That's externalism versus internalism. So the meaning is not just something that's all inside my head. Notice we talked about the relationship between philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. The meaning also not something magically contained inside the word or inside the proposition or inside the paragraph or inside the language as all. Rather, remember, we've already got some tools here. We can think about functional role semantics. That is the idea that we don't really have that more magical notion of meaning, but rather there's the question of what are we doing by speaking and using the words that we use. All right, now let's look at this first bullet point. And again, confession here. I didn't have. Let me step out to tell you the story of Twin Earth. I guess when I first encountered this, I think it was in graduate school really, and I didn't have anybody around who was really good, very good at explaining to me what on earth, or pardon the pun, Hilary Putnam was doing with his twin Earth argument. Just for the life of me, I couldn't see why. It was significant. Now I understand it, and so that took me some work. So it would be my pleasure if I could make it easier for you to understand it. So what's going on here? Again, well, we're talking about this notion of semantic externalism, that the meaning of the content also has to do not just with what's up in my head, as the Cartesian dualist would say, that is just everything that's in my soul, that's in my mind, which is completely different from the rest of the world. And the empiricist here is saying, no, actually, the psychological description also extends to facts outside of the head, or your head, if you will, outside of your body. So here's the thought experiment, the Twin Earth thought experiment. You've got Earth, and then you've got a place called Twin Earth. And Twin Earth is molecule for molecule identical to Earth. So for example, you have a doppelganger on Twin Earth, and your doppelganger is molecule for molecule identical to you, which, and Putnam's always doing this, notice he's talking both at the same time about the physical molecular state that your body's in, like that your brain's in, and at the same time, he's also talking about the mental state that you're in, the supposed representational state that you're in. He's making the same points about both, that neither one of them necessarily has to do with the meaning, quote unquote. So, all right. So, Twin Earth is exactly the same as Earth, except for one thing, and that is that here on Earth, the tasteless, odorless, colorless fluid that we need to survive and that is ubiquitous, we call water, is made out of H2O, two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. Molecules and a molecule, right, I'm sorry. It's a molecule. All right, I'm not kidding. All right, so, but on Twin Earth, water, what they call water, that is what your doppelganger calls water. When your doppelganger is thinking about water, thinking about drinking a glass of water, or taking a shower, or standing next to a lake. Water. But on Twin Earth, water happens to be XYZ. It's not H2O, it's XYZ. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that people look, me and my doppelganger are in exactly the same state. We speak the same language, English in this case, and we both have the same kind of beliefs and attitudes towards water, and we both call it water. Okay, so both our internal mental states and our external states, as our observable external state, is exactly the same. There is no difference at all. And yet, the meaning of our belief is different. I have beliefs about H2O. My doppelganger has beliefs about XYZ. Really kind of simple as that. And so the point is that the thing that's varied, here's another example that I made up, and I do believe it works the same way. This morning, say, the house was painted green, and I believed it was painted green, and my house was green, and I came on down here to the lab. And then in the meantime, while I've been gone, my guys up at the house have painted it. They painted it tan. Well, notice now I'm still in the exact same mental state and the exact same physical state. Nothing's changed in my brain, in the molecules or anything like that. There's been no neurochemical change in my brain. Nor has any part of my belief system changed at all. I believe that my house is green, just like I believed it was green when I woke up this morning. Only we've been saying, right, that propositions have these semantic properties. The semantic property of meaning is the one that varied in the twin earth example. But another one of the semantic properties is the semantic property of having a truth value, of being true or false. And in this case, in the case where unbeknownst to me, my house has changed its color since this morning, and therefore nothing has changed about either my psychological state or my physical state. The semantic property of my belief has changed. It's flipped from true to false. The proposition that my house is green. So again, it's a strange set of arguments, isn't it? My psychology professor dad got impatient with me once because I was trying to explain this to him and I didn't understand it well enough to do it. It does sound, that sounds kind of crazy. But these are the kinds of arguments. Let's go back to semantic externalism. So third bullet point then, this is just where we're going with this. We're going with semantic externalism. The meaning of I am in a brain in a vat, like all beliefs that people have then, depends on the story about where the belief came from, how I got to be in that belief, and also the kinds of things that a being like me can believe. So here's the argument then. And after this, I think we just have one more slide of reflections. But here's what the argument is, and here's where you have to become active, because philosophy is an activity, and at some point or the other, you're going to have to make a decision about whether you think something makes sense or not. You can't ask anybody else whether it makes sense or not. It's just all up to you. That's the thing. So here's the argument that Putnam gives us, which he claims proves that we are not, in fact, brains and vats. When I say, me, human being, say brains and vats, I say, I wonder, could I be a brain in a vat? I'm referring to physical objects, brains, vats, that are the causes of my sensory experiences. That is, I've seen brains and vats. I've dealt with brains, and not very much. I've seen a lot of pictures of brains, dealt with vats, not as much as anybody. So yeah, that's what I'm referring to, brains and vats. And that's where that comes from. My beliefs about brains and vats come from the actual brains and vats in my environment. And that's why, that's what I'm referring to. Now, all right, so then if a whole human being, let's remember this, a whole human being like me, one who's not a brain in a vat, we're just saying for the sake of discussion here, right? Not a brain in a vat, okay? So, but it doesn't matter, it's not about me, it's just about such a person who is not in fact a brain in a vat. If they think I'm a brain in a vat, that's false, okay? Say I'm not a brain in a vat. If I think I'm a brain in a vat, that's false. Well, now, the brains in vats, I mean, presumably it's possible that there are brains in vats who don't know that they're brains in vats. I mean, in fact, it has to be true, doesn't it? In order for it to be the case that I might be a brain in a vat, or you might be a brain in a vat, then it certainly does look as if that entails that there are some brains in vats, at least me, the brain, and you, the brain, who don't know that they're brains in the vats, who believe that they're human beings. Um, and those brains in vats, I guess, might be talking about the brains in the vats. Are we brains in vats? We might be brains in vats. But Putnam says they're not actually referring to brains in vats the way you and I are referring to brains in vats. Remember the causal story about how you and I came to have our beliefs about brains in vats was our actual experience with actual brains in vats. But the brains in the vats have never had any experience with actual brains in vats. There's a reasonable question here, by the way, as to whether it's not a good idea usually to try to nitpick the counterfactual apart because it's sort of not in the spirit of the thing. You want to see what is the idea that the counterfactual is trying to get at. But in this case, I mean, it does sort of matter if the brain in the vat necessarily was a human being having human being experiences before they became a brain in the vat. And that does kind of, I think, cause some problems for this argument. If, you know, that's what we have to assume. I'm not sure we have to assume that. I think the brains in the vats are counterfactual things too. And so I'm not sure that Putnam's committed to the implication that the brains in the vats already had embodied experiences and those were the experiences that caused them to have the reference to brains in vats that they do. I mean, like I say, it's an interesting counter argument that got some attention, but I don't think it stops this argument actually, because I don't think we have to assume that the brains in vats are human brains that were once embodied in human bodies. I think the brains in vats are conceptual. But in any event, the point is this: when brains in vats, whatever they may be, think I might be a brain in a vat. They're not referring to brains and vats the way that I'm referring to brains and vats. Okay, you see that now. They're not referring to the things I refer to because they didn't come to have those kinds of beliefs of that, the mental content, whatever it is that they have, the same way that I did. So if the brain in the vat says, I am a brain in a vat, that's false too. It has to be false because it can't mean whatever I mean by brain or vat. That's the funky argument. The brain in a vat says, I'm a brain in a vat. It's false. It's false in human English, it's false. And the conclusion is necessarily then I'm not a brain in a vat. That's the argument. It's an argument from the way that reference works. Okay. Let's do some reflections. Notice he's recognizably a 20th century empiricist philosopher. He's concentrating on language, logic, and theory of reference, because he suspects that if he does so, he might find things to be a pseudo problem. And he does, in fact, think that the evil demon problem is a pseudo problem. So this externalism, and I think in retrospect, one of the things Hilary Putnam is most identified with is externalism, semantic externalism. Grows out of this theory, this tradition, this empiricist tradition. You have a causal theory of reference. Again, what's that? That's that there's some sort of story, that grounding, anchoring story about how from reality, somehow the real world, then there was a chain of causation such that you were caused to have the mental formation. Such as when you banged your leg on the table, that's how you realize the table was there. That's a good, really good solid justification for believing that the table's there. Okay. All right, so it's a monist materialist semantics. Monist materialist, not dualistic, doesn't say there's a mind that's separate from the body at all. And also then notice the relationship between that and the representational theory of mind. The disembodied soul is looking at the representation in the head or something. And then another thing about this, and this is when I mentioned Kant right at the beginning. Kant's all right on it. You know, Kant understands this problem, I have to say, in fairness. So nobody gets the wrong idea. I don't understand that. Cartesian dualism is just sort of disembodied God's eye view, like all the souls are the same, right? Because they're not material, they're not contingent. There's no contingency. Think about Spinoza and Leibniz. There's no contingency. So we all have the same kind of disembodied God's eye view, and we either have a good view or a bad one. But Putnam says it's the form of life, that's a Wittgensteinian notion, the kind of body, these are things that are organizing what we call mental life. As I say, Kant also sees that clearly, and Wittgenstein acknowledges that Kant sees that too, by the way, somewhere. At least he says he likes Kant. So now then, okay, fine. So those are just, again, trying to put this argument, this remarkable article, into enough context, conceptual context, and historical context that we have a chance to understand it in all its complexities. But the last bullet point then, just to end, is where we have to do some of our own thinking. So the claim is that normal humans, assuming we're those, cannot be brains in a vat. And the argument on the last slide proves it. And this, and as Putnam himself says, this is counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to say we can't be brains in vats, because if brains in vats said that they were brains in vats, they'd be incorrect, because what they mean by brains in vats is the same thing that we mean by brains in vats. And they'd be incorrect from our point of view. I think that's another strand here that we could pull on. But Putnam says he thinks it's right. In fact, he says he thought about it for 2 years, I think he says. And then finally had to say, no, he does think that it's right, that it's persuasive. An argument is persuasive, it makes you really believe that it's true. So this is the argument. It's very closely related, I think, in that sense, to the Wittgensteinian argument that we got about the proper use of the verb to know against skepticism about the external world. It's an argument about language and about the way that language works, and about what you can and cannot do with language. And so, again, in that sense, very 20th century. I don't think there's more. Oh, okay. But you know, Putnam is audacious and remarkable, and gosh, I actually am pulled by this argument. I think this is a really, really important argument somehow. And so I think that you can read this article and think about that, and at the same time, of course, learn more about empiricism in general by doing that, and skepticism. All right, good. I will now bid you adieu until we crack up.